Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Lucinda Rouse.
And I'm Andy Ricketts. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be thinking about organisational closures and how funders can ensure an optimal spend out that doesn't leave the charities they support on a cliff edge.
We're joined today by Ruth Hollis, who is the Chief Executive of Spirit of 2012, the legacy charity of the London 2012 Olympics and Paralympics, which received a £47 million endowment from the National Lottery Community Fund. The charity will be closing at the end of this year after 12 years of research and projects focused on social impact and large-scale events that promote well-being. Hello, Ruth.
Hello.
I'm going to jump straight in on the topic of ending, since that is the core focus of this episode. When we spoke in preparation for this discussion today, you said that most projects have a difficult end in general. Why do you think that is?
So I think it's very difficult for organisations and projects to imagine what the world looks like when they're not there, particularly when you've been delivering for a long time. So Spirit was set up at the start of 2013 by the big lottery fund, as it was then, to think about the social legacy of the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. So the social legacy being how it brought people together, made people feel about their communities, made people, dare I say, feel a bit prouder of being British and all those things that we now look back very fondly and think about. We were set up both to do funding and research, and so we've been on a journey over the past 12 years where we've been thinking about our ending. We were always set up to close. That was part of the plan. We had to spend out the money within 10 years, although because of COVID we've extended it a little bit. And we've been working with projects who have got time-limited programmatic funding. So we've seen endings from both that programme perspective and now from an organisational closure perspective. And I think it's difficult because it is that sense of imagining what the world looks like when your project is no longer running. Often programmatic funding or being a funder enables you to do some amazing things that you're really proud of as an organisation. And so that stopping can be very difficult, both for the organisation, the people that are running it, but more important for the beneficiaries. And, I think we've always grappled with that tension that our projects have focused on working with the people that were furthest from participation, breaking down barriers, being really clear about access and inclusion, particularly for young people and disabled people. And the end of project funding can mean a cliff edge for them in terms of the amazing things that we've been funding them to be able to do.
And do you think there's anything to be said about the way that projects are designed and set up in the first place? Is the prospect and eventuality of an ending sometimes overlooked?
I think it can be overlooked. One of the really funny things about the process we're in at the moment was, although we were set up as a spend out, once we started to do the planning and went back to our constitutional documents, there wasn't actually very much about the ending. So even starting as something time limited, looking forward to that closing point wasn't something that people did at the beginning. Now, with hindsight, I think everybody should be looking at their endings and thinking about what that looks like. I think one of the difficult things for funded projects, and Spirit has been guilty of this looking back on it, is that funders always ask that question about sustainability. How will you make this project sustainable? And the elephant in the room is that's really difficult without further funding, right? So thinking about how projects can be mainstreamed, or how what you're learning in the project leads to changes in practice that then continue some of the outcomes that you've been delivering from the project is really important. But I think that cliff edge is really tricky, both for delivery organisations and for funders to manage. And I'm not sure on either side we've got it entirely right yet.
And you've been at Spirit of 2012 since the beginning, yes, albeit in different positions over the past 10, 12 years. At what point did the organisation start thinking about closure?
So we always knew we were going to close. In 2018, the trustees started to think about continuing. And I think that's always a temptation. I think once you've hit your stride, you're really proud of what you're delivering, you've made a name for your brand in the sector, thinking about stopping is quite difficult. So in 2018, we started to have a look at whether we wanted to carry on. one of the interesting things is being a kind of legacy organisation of an event, we were kind of always set up in a way to think about what legacy looks like. And in some senses, the question about how long you can sustain the impact of an event is quite crucial. And, my teenage daughter will happily roll her eyes and say, everybody else has moved on. Like, get over it. It was in 2012. But there was still something about it. So the trustees had a look at whether they wanted to continue. At that stage, we were largely operating as a funder. So what they were thinking about was whether they would fundraise to generate money to then disperse. And having had a really good look at it, what they felt was, although we delivered real value, we felt, to our grant-funded partners, we didn't think that was justification enough to fundraise from pots of money that they arguably would also be looking to raise funds from. So at that point, we decided not to fundraise. In 2019, we were developing our new strategy, Happier People, Happier Places, and we set our course to close at the end of 2026 and decided that we were definitely going to close then. COVID came along and obviously had lots of impacts for us in terms of our projects, finances, all of those things that everybody else has been grappling with. So we're actually closing slightly earlier than we thought. But that was when they made the decision to definitely close. And actually, it was really liberating. It's a real privilege actually running an organisation that has secure funding for a certain amount of time, where you can be absolutely focused on the outcomes and not having to think about fundraising and what the future looks like. And I know that's a very unusual and lovely position to be in.
Interesting to hear that at one point you had thought of closing at the end of 2026 and have brought that forward by a year in response, as you said, to COVID. Was that just a result of costs becoming so much greater, so you had less money to play with?
It was a result of that, but also when we were planning the staffing that we needed, our grant funding programs were finishing earlier. We have programs called things like Get Out, Get Active, right? They're operating in an environment where people can neither get out nor get active during that time. Lots of our projects had to pause. We wanted to make sure that we could offer them the opportunity to do time-bound extensions, so extend the end of their project so they could continue working with their beneficiaries. That meant we had to have grant staff for longer than we thought. So it was a financial decision, really, in terms of keeping the organisation at a larger operating base for longer and then having to bring forward the end date.
In terms of those conversations around potentially continuing, what form might that have taken? I mean, were you thinking potentially about just being set up forever, or would it have been just an extension to the time-limited spell of the organisation? And even what would it have meant for the charity if it had decided to carry on?
They were looking for a time-limited extension, so we wouldn't have been able to become an in perpetuity organisation without really changing the constitution. So what they were looking for was probably at that stage another 5 to 6 years. It would have meant the organisation switching into fundraising, which we know can be hugely time-consuming, can take a lot of resource. They had real questions over whether it was right to use the resource that we had been granted to disperse as grants to fundraise to then bring money in. We were at that point also shifting to think about, we've always been a very learning-focused organisation, and thinking about what that learning meant in the kind of policy world around events. And we've actually taken a much bigger shift towards that from 2020 onwards. My view is it would have really unhelpfully disrupted the organisation to do that. Equally, when you're in an organisation, and as I say, you're delivering successfully, the idea that you will stop is hard. It's quite emotional. A lot of the staff have been with us for a long time. A lot of the trustees have been with us for a long time. So we often talk about being a spend out as our superpower, and we decided to just go resolutely after that rather than try and extend.
To what extent do you think are there other charities that are in the same kind of position where they're looking to spend out, but then maybe they have second thoughts? Could you talk a little bit about the things that you've learned from the process that you went through that might be helpful for them?
So there are other National Lottery trusts, and we know that there are other funders thinking about whether they spend out their endowments or whether they continue. It's a difficult one because it depends, I think, largely on the sectors in which they're funding and how well set up they are to continue. and the change that those organisations feel they can make in the longer term. One of the things when funders started spending out their endowments, one of the bits of feedback we had from some of the charities that we were working with was, this sounds brilliant, but where is the money going to come from? When we're looking 5-10 years, hence our strategies, we don't understand what our fundraising landscape looks like. So it causes difficulty and disruption. For us, as I say, being a spend out and making that decision let us be absolutely resolute in what we were doing, in focusing on the outcomes we were trying to deliver, on doing the research and evidence gaps that we knew were out there in order to be able to let us feel like we'd finished well. That takes quite a lot of planning and a different mindset. But there are opportunities for organisations to do some of that without closing. I think the mindset in itself is quite interesting in terms of how you collate everything you've learned, how you think about what that means for the organisation, how you have periods of kind of reflection. And I wonder if you could do that organisationally without thinking then about closing. But it's a hard decision to make. We were helped by the fact it was always in our constitution to close. So in a way, it was easier for us to say, no, we'll stick to the knitting. And that's what we'll definitely do. We won't look to extend. But I think for trustees currently in perpetuity organisations who are looking to close, I imagine that's a very difficult set of choices to make.
And in terms of your staff then, are they all just employed on temporary contracts, or how do you organise that?
No, they're all employed permanently. I'm really lucky that the staff team have been with us for a long time now. We've seen a real loyalty to the organisation, and that's absolutely brilliant. We've had some people move on, and one of the lovely things is seeing ex-staff moving on to other funders and taking some of our practice with them. But no, they're all on permanent contracts, and then we're in the process, obviously, of going through a round of redundancy, which is difficult, but we've always been very open with people that they are joining an organisation that isn't going to last forever. We've been very clear with people what the time frame is. They understand that. All of the training and development and outplacement support we've put in has focused on that time frame. But it is still difficult. We've got 3 people leaving at the end of November, in the run-up to closing at the end of January. And it's tricky. It's tricky for people. When they get the letter, that's a whole different relationship with your employer. But our approach has just been to be as open and transparent as possible. I was just going to say that's also a juggle because you don't want to talk yourself down too early. I did all the planning for closure in 2023 on the basis that I wanted 2024 to deliver and not talk about it. I was quite at that stage, quite bored is the wrong word, but I wanted to stop talking about closing because I thought we'd run out of steam too early if we weren't careful. So that balance of when you start talking about it, when you start preparing the team, against being transparent and being open about it is quite a careful balance.
And did you take any measures to try and keep people in post for as long as possible? It must be very disruptive if you had a lot of people leaving, say in 6, 8, 10 months before closure.
We haven't got a lot of measures in place. We've got a redundancy scheme that people know is coming. They've had lots of support in looking at their future careers and what that might look like. We've got a consultancy budget that means that if people left, we would be able to backfill them. But no, keeping people is hard. We are very lucky people have stayed and stayed till the end. It's a real juggle to be able to do that.
I'd like to move on now to think about some of the programs and partners that you've worked with. It sounds that as a funder, as an organisation, you've had quite a few moments of reflection, pause to think, where are we going? Are we going to extend? When are we going to close? And all the rest of it. Have you been able to build in those moments of reflection and evaluation into the projects that you funded?
We have with some, yes. Part of being a spend out and part of thinking about what the body of evidence, the body of impact would look like when we closed meant that we developed a theory of change very early on. That's one of the first things we did. Our founding chief executive, Debbie Lai, came from an international development background. So she was used to working with theories of change and very set monitoring and evaluation frameworks. So that's what we set out to do. We have always been pretty prescriptive in the way we wanted people to monitor and evaluate their projects and the outcomes that we wanted them to investigate. And around that, we set frameworks to support them to do that. So All of our projects have had support to develop their own theories of change, their own monitoring and evaluation frameworks, and lots of them were in cohorts where we've really focused on developing wraparound support with them from evaluators, support in developing their monitoring and evaluation, but also peer learning and reflection points. So a number of our projects have operated on different timeframes, but 3 to 6 months, then a reflection point, thinking about then how that changes the project, how they want to think about the next iteration of it. I think one of the things that's been really important for us is that if you're going to ask people to collect data and you're going to ask them to take it seriously, you have to enable them to use it and think about what it actually means for the project. So one of those brilliant projects we did was called Empower. It was with the I Will Fund and delivered by UK Youth. And after each cohort, so this was around the centenary of women's suffrage, they had cohorts of girls doing social learning, social impact projects. And after each cohort, they had a pause in the programme, looked at the data, looked at what it was telling them before they then recruited the next set of girls and moved on. Now, what that enabled them to do after the first cohort was realise that they weren't actually reaching disabled girls and young women. So they were able to then take that pause to redesign the recruitment to make sure that they were being genuinely inclusive and bringing in different groups. So looking back at our funding practice and what we would recommend to other funders, that sense of having a really supportive framework that projects were operating to and those pause and reflection points is something we'd really recommend.
And did you allocate specific budget for evaluation activities?
Yeah, so all of our projects could use up to 10% of their budget on evaluation activities, either internally or by bringing somebody in. And we then allocated some of our funding to the wraparound evaluation. So to give you an example, we had a programme called the Carers Music Fund, which was looking at music making activities with groups of female carers. That was a cohort of projects across the country. They had 10% of their budget to spend on evaluation activity. We then had an evaluator that sat across the top looking at the whole cohort of projects, and they had the What Works Centre for Wellbeing there to support them on evaluation. So we've always felt that we can't ask people to monitor and evaluate seriously without that support and that wraparound.
Yeah, and it was interesting that you used the word prescriptive in terms of what you asked your grantees to do. In that respect, I know I've been doing some research into impact measurement practices across the sector and hearing from organisations that receive funding from multiple different funders, each have got their own set of demands. That's very, very difficult, particularly for smaller charities who are having to field all of these requests and make sure they're measuring the right things and often quite different things. How do you take that into consideration?
So we asked them to measure a very small number of things. So what we were really focused around from our theory of change was wellbeing. So we asked all of our projects to measure using the ONS4 wellbeing metrics. So that's 4 questions, 3 if you're working with young people. We also asked people to explore perceptions around disability and impairment. Originally, we asked them to do that with a standard metric, and then we found that just didn't work. So we used the British Attitude Survey question around perceptions of disability, and it just wasn't workable to use in practice. So actually we then moved to a more qualitative framework. We then asked projects to think about what they wanted to learn. So we had a bank of questions that they could use, of data sets, but they thought about what they wanted to learn. That was pushing in a different direction to a lot of other funders and also a lot of what charities were telling us they wanted. You know, we were trying to do that at a time when the pressure for core funding and looser funding arrangements became even greater. But because we were a spend out and thinking about that impact over 12 years, we kind of stuck to our guns. The ONS questions were not very popular to begin with, necessarily, either with projects or necessarily with other funders. So there was a lot of negotiation with people around what they would do, what they wouldn't do, how that was reflected to us. But beyond that, we tried to be very flexible in terms of, for example, how they would report to us. If we were one funder with lots of other funders, for example, when we've been working with Cities of Culture, we've often had really good conversations about how those projects can report in a way that suited them to multiple funders, while sticking to our guns around the ONS4.
And then what did you do with that information that you received from your various programs and grantees?
So we've been using it really actively all the way through, really. In the early days, we were looking at it in terms of what it meant for program design for future programs. So we would take the evidence from our earlier projects and interrogate that in terms of what it meant for future project design and how we could help organisations think about the design of their projects better. We've been very open about sharing data, collating it together, putting it on our website. We've had lots of learning events and webinars and different things. What it's enabled us to do at the end is really reflect on the 12 years and the whole span of the 12 years, which has been brilliant. Having that kind of small number of set metrics consistently over a long time has really enabled us to look very deeply at our impact at the end. Now, we've done it in quite a different way in that we decided quite early on in the closure process that we didn't, with the greatest of respect to evaluators, we didn't want another general evaluation of what we've been doing. We didn't feel it was the right time to mark our own homework because it wouldn't be looking at improving our practice going forward because we were closing. So what we've done is we procured 3, we're calling them legacy learning partners, to whom we've opened up the whole archive of learning to enable them to develop products for their sectors going forward. So Pro Bono Economics have taken all of the wealth of evidence we've got over the last 12 years on wellbeing and done work around quantitative wellbeing measurement, some really interesting work around wellbeing measurement and how other funders and other projects can use that. Belong, the Cohesion and Integration Network, have taken all of our evidence on how events can contribute to social cohesion, and they've created a toolkit for local authorities, and also they're looking at creating a measure. So we wanted it to be actively applied rather than having a really nice report that said, didn't they do well? And then we never looked at again.
You have published a final report already.
Yes.
With that in mind, what was the point of that and what are you aiming to get from publishing that report?
So that report really, so having the kind of detailed learning from the legacy learning partners actually allowed us to take a kind of higher level and I guess celebratory look at what we've done. At the end of 12 years, we wanted to really celebrate the work of our projects and the work of everybody that's been involved in the organisation, to look at the overall impact of that £47 million we got from the National Lottery. It's really important for us to be able to articulate the impact of that. And so having the deep learning, I guess, vested with the legacy learning partners who are taking that forward, that's all going to be publicly accessible. Our website is going to be available for 3 years after we close, at least, and then it's available on their websites as well and signposted. It enabled us to just take, I guess, more of a kind of storytelling view to the last 12 years rather than a traditional evaluation report.
There's a lot of charities, I think, at the moment, particularly in the present climate, that feel like they're on a bit of a hamster wheel in terms of applying for funding and then almost having to start the whole process again immediately once that's finished. In the context of your charity closing and obviously not being able to provide any funding in the long term, I wonder if you can talk a bit about the responsibility that funders have to provide follow-on funding in that kind of an environment.
It's really difficult, and it's one of the things we grappled with from the very beginning. So even for our first cohort of projects, we knew that we didn't just want to stop after 3 years or whatever. We always had multi-year funding. Most of our projects were at least 3 years long. They're just hitting their stride, actually, in 3 years. I think time spans are kind of odd things. For our organisation, we're coming up to the 12-year point, actually really hitting our stride at 10 years, and that made us think, should we stop? So for projects just really delivering, having to think about shutting their project at 2.5 years if you've got 3-year funding, staff that you've employed to run a project, starting to think about what their next moves are, can be really disruptive. So for some of our projects, we allowed them to apply for what we called extended impact funding. So could they go for further? We really encouraged projects to think about tapering towards the end. So where we weren't going to fund them even further, could they avoid a cliff edge by balancing their budgets to have smaller amounts of funding at the end just to keep things going a little bit, to then be able to signpost people into whatever happened next. It's a real double-edged sword because actually funders want new things. we find consistently. So we've got some absolutely amazing projects. So Get Out, Get Active that we funded for 8.5 years that works with the very least active to get them physically active. A project called Our Day Out with Creative Arts East, working with people with dementia to get them involved in music making and other arts activities, both of which we funded for extended periods, 7 and 8 years, both of which have absolutely incredible evidence. They are really evidence-based, but the need for something new means it's almost harder at that extended point to then fundraise. So I think it's a really difficult balance, both for funders to get right and for the organisations when they're thinking about what that planning looks like.
And how do you think charity funders should manage that tension then between the length of time that they fund organisations for and yet enabling them to, as you say, hit their stride?
Long-term funding is critical. You know, one of the things I would have wanted us to do were we continuing is think about the boundary between programmatic funding and core funding and whether there's a segue between the two. So whether it isn't an either or, but programmatic funding leads to practice changes that could then possibly be enhanced by core funding to continue that for longer. Now, we weren't able to do that because we were closing. All of our funding ended up being programmatic funding. But I think thinking about that kind of long-term trajectory, really important. Also thinking about the changing needs of beneficiaries. Even when you fund something for 8 years, what people need is going to change. So how can you be as flexible as possible within that scope? I was really pleased that at our conference, one of the organisations that we've funded called our funding companionable. They said we were a companionable funder, which for me, I found that quite an emotional moment because we've always wanted to be positive partners with people. We've always wanted to work with them. And partly that's because we were being quite demanding with the data. So, you know, we wanted to be alongside them and really learning. We've come at everything with a real curiosity. But that companionable funding, I think, is really important. If you can strike that right over the long term and then think about what endings look like so you're not creating a cliff edge, I think that would be the kind of the gold standard, really.
And from where you've been sitting for the past 10, 12 years, have you identified any areas where funders could be working together better? And are there any big changes in the funding landscape that you'd like to see in that respect?
As you mentioned at the beginning, we were the legacy funder for the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. A lot of our funding is focused around events. Events are something where lots of funders come together and lots of funders want to be involved. There's something about the shine of an event that people want to be associated with, and that's brilliant. But that's quite a hard jigsaw for then the delivery organisations to put together. So we've done a piece of work with Warwick Business School around what the ecosystem of funding looks like around an event, which I think is applicable in other sectors. So thinking about what the kind of ecosystem looks like for funders, where are funders best placed for their funding to support developments, rather than being lured into funding sexier things. Where is their funding best place to work, and how do we make that attractive for them to stay in the ecosystem, to understand where they fit with others and the impact that kind of multiplicity of funding is having on delivery organisations.
So it's great to hear about the research that you've been doing, one of many pieces of research over the life of the organisation. Are there any other ways in which Spirit of 2012 has tried to influence other funders to make funding practices more beneficial based on your experience?
Yeah, so I think we've mostly tried to do that where we've worked in partnership with other funders. You know, £47 million is a lot of money. It also means we're actually a bit of a minnow. And what we've focused on is quite specific bits of what we've done that they could learn from. A great example that we have from one of our very earliest projects with the British Red Cross is to have flexible access budgets. So what they said to us was, what we'd really like is a pot of money that we can just use however we want to enable people to participate. And we will report to you on it, but we just want to be able to use it to break down barriers. So if somebody needs a taxi, if we need an interpreter, whatever it is, staff on the ground can just make that happen without coming back and asking for more funding. That worked so brilliantly that we've applied that then to all of our projects. We've often, when people came in for funding, challenged them on whether they had enough in the access pot. So when they were working with very vulnerable or marginalised groups, I think people often are quite reticent when they're bidding for money to say, actually, we would like this pot of money to be available for access. So we would go back to people and say, well, you need more, actually. If you want to work with that beneficiary group, you're going to need more money to support them. Bits of practice like that we've tried to share with other funders through things like the I Will working group, through working with Arts Council, Sport England and others around events. And I hope that as we reflect on those 12 years, there will be more bits of that practice that people will pick up on in the funding world.
And looking back over the last 10 years of the funding that you've done, is there anything that you would do differently with the benefit of hindsight?
It's interesting because obviously coming up to closing, that's something I'm thinking a lot about at the moment. I think one of the things that I would do differently, we, as well as doing grant funding, we've also done research into evidence gaps and thinking about then how that translates into policy. I would have started that process earlier. It got slightly hampered by COVID, but thinking about added evidence bits around funding could have started earlier, and that would have been very helpful. The work we've done with our legacy learning partners, opening our archives to them, has been absolutely incredible in terms of what they've been able to deliver. If we knew then what we know now about that process, I would have wanted to do that much earlier in the process and really get expert partners engaged in interrogating all of the learning to create new products, to make those kind of systems better. Doing it at the end is great, but it's slightly frustrating that a lot of the kind of good stuff from that is going to come once we've closed. We always set ourselves up to want to develop and deliver really credible learning that we could then use to influence policy around events. And that takes time. Really thinking about the time it takes to get that credible evidence, to build it up, to get under the skin of it, to then turn it into kind of policy positions and policy works. We were probably ambitious originally to think we could do that in 10 years.
Well, Ruth, it's been fascinating to hear about your work and reflections on how things have gone and how things might look differently in the future. All the very best with the last couple of months of Closeout, and thank you so much for joining us.
Lovely. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Ruth, and that's it for this episode. From Andy and me and all of us at Third Sector, thank you so much for listening. Our producer is Jude Owen.